one thing why I really like this book is because this woman has done a lot of hard work. Like this is
Yes.
एक तो her personal
research.
contemplative, yeah, एक personal contemplative तो है ही, and then she's made sure to find out about these people, and ऐसे भी नहीं कि ऊपर ऊपर से mention कर दिया. She's gone into their, like she's gone deep into their archives. It takes guts to first accept your pain, then discover it, then further be contemplative about it through another person's POV. Considering loneliness, तुम्हारी सब अलग है. Even then, she's dealt with someone else's. Like reading such traumatic stories is bound to make you captivated for a while. हम तो फिर भी 10-15 पेज पढ़ रहे हैं एक इंसान के बारे में. She's read like 5,000 pages worth of memoir and all that.
What do you think the book was about? What do you think it made you understand about loneliness, about yourself, or just what was the vibe of the book, and why did you end up finishing it if you did?
I'm like 4 pages short of the book. I just have to read 4 more pages. But yes, the overall, I read it through an audiobook on Audible, because I'm not really a non-fiction person. But because the topic of urban loneliness somewhat is, it's an inevitable thing. If you're in a metro city, if you're moving jobs, even if you're happily in love, even then this particular phenomena is inevitable. I'm planning to switch jobs, and just the thought of being in another city is like, oh my god, चलो मैं गाइड वाइज तो तैयार है. मुझे पता है कि मैं दूसरे शहर में जाऊंगी तो मुझे वो शहर को कैसे नेविगेट करना है. That way Olivia has done, I think, a great job. I honestly didn't even feel that she's written. Although she's mentioned Times Square time and again, and how Times Square changed for her, how it used to be a place for everyone before, and now it's only a place for advertisers and big corporates. I could compare parts of that to how there are places in Bombay which I think have become very commercial in the last 7 years. So I was constantly drawing parallels. Apart from the painters and artists that she mentioned, one person's Henry Darger that she mentioned, that caught me. And I couldn't like read after that, after I read Henry Darger's story, because just it's like almost a beggar or a person who's just way beyond the poverty line has so much talent in it, and we just ignored. Like as a society, the person was completely non-existent. So that just took me by a chance. And yeah, I mean, it was honestly a very surreal experience to finish reading this book.
Do you want to elaborate on the person you just mentioned, because this is not somebody I've read in the book yet?
Yes.
So do you want to maybe let's say summarize it for me or people who might have not finished that part?
Yes. So Henry Darger's chapter is the realms of unreal. I think it's the 5th chapter.
Yeah.
This person, his life started, and probably in the first few years his mother passed away and his father was terminally ill. So he was basically born to just take care of his parents, for starters. And even later, he got abandoned by his father because his father couldn't take care of him any further, and he had to live his most of his adult, like early life, in an orphanage. And then he worked for 54 years as a sweeper and a caretaker of old people in a hospital. This person, like no one knew about him until he moved to an apartment, moved out of that apartment. And once he moved out of that apartment, there were cartons and journals after journals which were discovered. He had made some paintings which had atrocious violence against children. So a lot of people, by just looking at his painting, people assumed him to be a pedophile, or someone who's a sexual addict or something like that. But later, when this, I think Olivia and only a few people have probably read his journal, his I think it's called The History of My Life, or it's his memoir. That is some 5,000 pages long. Every day he's made basic journal entries: ate sandwich, felt miserably cold, and that's it. Like there are just lines that he's written, and there are 5,000 pages. There's this one, and yeah, so people just discovered his paintings, and then the landlord and the person who moved after him, both of these two people have taken the initiative of making sure that the world knows about him. They try to first understand his work, they name his paintings, they put out exhibits, and then they sell it for a, like, they probably sell one painting for much more amount than he earned in one year.
Mm.
And then there are small instances about his life that are mentioned. For example, he befriended a person called Willie, who was probably the watchman in the same hospital he worked. When Willie's mom died, he moved to another place with his sister, and Henry doesn't know the exact place where he moved. Then Willie died, and the sister just informed him that he's died now, and if you want, you can come for the funeral. But turns out that the hospital that he was working for, they didn't even give him a leave to attend his friend's funeral, and that was his only friend. Like, he's mentioned that probably my only friend, and now that he's also gone, I feel miserably alone. And he didn't get leave to go. And if you know someone like that, you feel so heartfelt. Like, after reading Raj's story, I was just walking on the road and I was just constantly staring at people who felt just like, बहुत सारी झुर्रियां हैं चेहरे पे, बहुत बूढ़े हैं, and you were just staring at them. What if their life is also something like this? Like, forget the art part. What if they have one friend and they're not able to tend to that friend? Like, that's their only friend in life. So I think it gave me a very astonishing look at how we are as individuals as well. Of how is someone else's pain something we look at for 5 minutes, or will it change something deeply inside us?
So the thing that made him the most different from all the other artists was that all the other artists, they came from an art history wala background, and their art was performative. Iska art was personal. So for him, these horrific images that he drew, he was venting as in art form because his life was not going his way. He was feeling very lonely. So Garake, he was venting on his canvas and he was drawing these terrific imagery just to like complain about his life in some way. He never meant for this art to be read and interpreted by someone else. And even when these paintings were discovered, he was very resistant to them becoming public. Like they were his diary entries in a lot of way.
I think when I was reading his work, I was really struck by this overpowering awareness that here's an artist who was really bearing it was almost like he was bearing the burden of his art. Like, it wasn't like it was coming to him like, he's scrapbooking joyfully and all of that. Like, none of this was done like that. It was so, like, it was so, you could almost, it was so palpable that he had to do this, and he had to borrow money, or he had to wait for a Christmas gift to get soap, but he had to do the artwork that he had to do. Like, it was such an important urge for him almost. So I think that was the overpowering sense that like I was sitting with, that art wasn't so much like, it wasn't fun and sunshine. It wasn't like that for him. It was really just very raw and very real, and very, just a place where he could really let out all the demons and shadows that he had been also perhaps battling with and was battling, until he died, I think. And also the other thing that I was just remembering, since they gave a lot of references to a lot of psychological processes, and I think because my work is in psychology, I was also remembering one of the studies that we had read was by this guy called John Cassiopo, and he was talking about how the more we are lonely, the more we start noticing new faces as threats. So we start keeping ourselves even more alienated and lonely, right? So, and one of the things that I was noticing with Darja specifically was that kind of an experience where he had been lonely all his life, and he was in the fringes and margins of society for so long, and he had been shunned almost for so long that after a point it started like he actually, you could read his diary entries that it almost feels like there is something like he's addled, in his mind. Like, there are so many mix up words, and he's not able to find the right phrasing and right syntax and all of that. Like, you can see so many things it's affecting the way he talks, the way he makes connections, all of that is also affected because of the immense impact of his early years, and the loneliness and the trauma and all of that.
There was this one part in the first or the second chapter, because you mentioned about the fact that loneliness is so repulsive that you tend to isolate yourself even more. There was this one line, which said, there's a perverse gratification in loneliness. Perhaps loneliness, despite its pain, permits them to continue a self-protective isolation, or provides them with an emotional handicap that forces handouts of pity from those with whom they interact. Now, this last bit probably doesn't fit what you're trying to say, but at least a bit about this this gratification, this very perverse gratification in the idea of being more lonely. Like, I think one more very different comparison to this, which I obviously tend to mention every other time, is Fight Club, in which there was this bit about
Oh my god, iconic.
yeah, like there was this entire bit about I want to destroy everything that is beautiful, and just the want to destroy everything that you can't have. It is because it is beautiful and you can't have it, even though you have it. Just the idea of destructing, and what how that physical act of destroying something can give you some sort of sadist emotional gratification of some kind.
Like, this book is obviously an exploration of different types of loneliness that are represented by different types of artists which were there. So, and I'm very glad that you made us watch Taxi Driver just before this book, because it is very easy to draw a comparison between this book artist and the various types of loneliness that Travis Bickle himself faced. So, like, first you have Andy Warhol, whose type of loneliness was more accepting. Like, he accepted his form of loneliness, he was comfortable in it. He in fact felt uncomfortable when he was exposed to something, right? Which we see in Travis at the beginning, that he is comfortable in his own loneliness. He doesn't want to be noticed as much. Then you had Daja, who was the escapist. He was lonely his whole day, but then he vented out that loneliness after he returned home on his canvas. So that is something that we see from Travis midway through the movie, where he's venting to the mirror after a day full of frustrations and loneliness. Then you had David. So David's form of loneliness was that of resistance, where he actively fought against the loneliness that he was subjected to, which we see in Travis towards the end. And the final type of loneliness that I observed in this book, which was not there in the movie, was Hopper, where, like, he was unwittingly lonely. Like, he didn't feel lonely as such, but people interpreted him to be lonely. So this was fascinating for me to see like different types of loneliness like this. And then there were obviously other types as well. Like, for example, in the 6th chapter, we see the loneliness of a community as a whole, where the homosexual community was ostracized due to the stigma associated with AIDS, where they were excommunicated from the society in a certain manner. And even we got to explore digital loneliness as well in chapter 7. I think that was my favorite bit from this particular book. So it was fascinating to see explorations of loneliness from these different perspectives.
I feel like it's that kind of a book that you only grasp at a time when you can relate to it probably, or you have had some lived experience.
Like, I saw the title and I read the few pages in the initial part of month, but then I was like, okay, I might not be able to relate to it much. So like, I started a bit late, and when I started it, the novel kind of forced me to recognize the parts of myself that I thought like that weren't looked after much. So like, at start I thought I wouldn't relate to it at all, and it would be a very hard time for me to actually complete the novel. But once I started reading, it was very uncomfortable, like literally very uncomfortable. And so that's why I wasn't even able to complete it. So I had to, like, I was going at my pace then. And also the starting verse that was mentioned, I think 13:5 Roman ka, I'm not exactly sure. So like, it said uska second line was, and every one members of the another. So like, I read it up like what exactly it meant. So it roughly translated to like that one person has many different parts that serves different functions. Similarly, we are countless different parts of one body, that is Christ, and we perform countless different jobs, but together by analogy, one unified being, that is single entity with what should be with, and like all of us should have a united purpose.
I think I was actually looking at it in the way that, in some way, I think loneliness is a very interesting thing, because when you have a particular malady, it generally it brings connection, right? Like if I have fever and someone else has fever, there is a connection, right? Like, but what, like we can talk about it, there is connection, but what happens with loneliness is that most people that we know in the world have felt lonely or are feeling lonely in some way or another, but there is no way to form connection, because that itself is what is upholding that loneliness, right? Like it's one of those strange things that everybody can feel at the same time and yet not feel connected by it.
One thing. So, Valerie Solanas once remarked, our society is not a community, but merely a collection of isolated family units. I think you must have caught that line. And I personally feel that there's no contradiction between the two, because I perceive it to be a hub and spoke model. Because यहाँ पे भी all the artists that we observe, I think with the exception of one artist, all of them are connected not to Christ, but to the city of New York, but they're not connected to each other. And that is, I think, the point of being lonely, where you feel connected to this idea of one, but you're not connected to other units that are a part of that one.
Yeah, I think the most accurate word is dense. Like these books are very dense. I don't even know if I can call it cathartic. Like that wasn't the case for me, at least. Cathartic, or at least the idea that, you know what, we at least have the art of these artists with us at least today. Like we can at least see that. That is a very selfish thing, I know. The fact that, you know, like chalo art to mila, artist nahi mila to. But like that is like that was the most cathartic thing for me. Just the idea that, you know what, I can actually just Google it and find 150 paintings of Edward Hopper, and I can just easily find Andy Warhol ke books, books or films as well. Just the idea that, you know, it's accessible today. Those people felt whatever they felt, but I can, you know, see their lives in the most investigative way possible and dissect it. Like there are
That
some.
exactly is something that she mentions
Yeah, she
in one
does.
part of her book, when she talks about the anonymity that the internet provides us, and how it sort of becomes a very antiseptic way to experience people without experiencing connection, which is so amazing, right? Like she keeps talking about that, which is exactly what the internet has done. We are able to get the information without any kind of some any kind of connection, and that possibility is what is, I think, really like it's exactly like encapsulated when you say that I can Google the art and I don't need to know the artist.
I think the art versus artist वाली debate तो मतलब काफी ऐसे tight चली रही है, and in fact I've seen some people suffer miserably and they are not yet, publicly artists. And I have asked them also, like, would you prefer all the pain and suffering and not yourself over it? Like, pain and suffering comes with the art, but you are coming without the art. So what will you prefer? And that person still said that no, I will prefer all the pain and suffering because it's coming with something which is immortal. The fact that we are discussing their art today is what makes them sort of immortal or whatever their thing is.
It's not like the art was the cause of their suffering. I think
Yes.
the art was their only beacon in that suffering.
David Warhol's tombstone that there was after he died, that is also died because of government neglect. Like his art is completely political because he died of AIDS. So, and AIDS at that time meant that the person has to live in solitary confinement. And due to that, loneliness in that community was to another level. And when he was one of those people whose ashes were taken to the White House and they were poured in the garden there. So various people who died of AIDS, the respective partners or their family members, they took their ashes, and David Bornorowitz's ashes were one of those ashes. One thing why I really like this book is because this woman has done a lot of hard work. Like this is
Yes.
एक तो her
Not
personal
research.
contemplative, yeah, एक personal contemplative तो है ही, and then she's made sure to find out about these people, and ऐसे भी नहीं कि ऊपर से mention कर दिया, she's gone into their, like she's gone deep into their archives. It takes guts to first accept your pain, then discover it, then further be contemplative about it through another person's POV, considering loneliness हमारी तुम्हारी सब अलग है. Even then he's dealt with someone else's, like reading such traumatic stories is bound to make you captivated for a while. हम तो फिर भी 10-15 पेज पढ़ रहे हैं एक इंसान के बारे में. She's read like 5,000 pages worth of memoir and all that.
I think that point requires some more consideration. That point that someone raised about, art from our past reaching out to cure our loneliness, because that is something that the writer explored as well. I quote, "It was the rawness and vulnerability of his expression that proved so healing to my own feelings of isolation. The willingness to admit to failure or grief, to let himself be touched, to acknowledge desire, anger, pain, to be emotionally alive. His self-exposure was in itself a cure for loneliness, dissolving the sense of difference that comes when one believes one's feelings or desires to be uniquely shameful." Now, I have a question that emanates from this, that we have all this art that is coming from lonely artists that is curing our loneliness. But does this art, in a way, does this art reaching us cure their loneliness as well? Or like, do they just suffer or sacrifice themselves for our sake?
There's a point mentioned where it said that desire for attention, it's the essential cure for not, like being existential today is a bigger problem than being lonely yesterday. All these people, they had somewhat a desire for attention, and maybe that's why they made sure that they are, except Arjun of course, they made sure that their work was out there being seen and then being discussed, and then somewhat had a contemplative effect on others as well.
But like, to a large extent, all of them died very lonely deaths, if you think about it.
Very
And
true.
this appetite for attention, that is something that cannot be satiated at all.
Yeah.
So like, it just makes you contemplate.
I feel like there's such a big difference, and I think she delineates that of the difference between connection and attention, right? You can have attention, but connection is not necessarily something that they were able to make. And I think she kept underlining the point that attention is not a substitute for connection.
There was also this one line also where it mentioned about how loneliness, it does not have anything to do with the number of people that are there around you. I'm obviously paraphrasing, but like that's the most simplest way to put it. Like it, and people who are alone, like living alone, can also be people who are not lonely. So people who are not seeking that. So it works both ways that way. And I think also I loved what Shreya also mentioned about the difference between attention. Like the fact that they're not opposites, attention and connection. Because as I just mentioned about me consuming their art is a selfish thing for me. Like I do not, honestly do not care about the artist after a point. Like for me, it is about what the art is making me feel. Because mere apne this problem hai. So I'll probably think about what this book, for example, as an art, I'll probably care about what this book makes me feel, what new ideas this book gives me, rather than what Olivia Laing is feeling right now, like about after like after so many years of putting this book out, or after being so famous now.
Olivia was very aware of this thing, the formatting that you mentioned, that the readers normally have a very impersonal connection with the artists, and that's why she deliberately inserted the biographies. Because if this were a normal essay, then she would just have analyzed loneliness from the context of the art which they have created. She did not need to add the backgrounds.
About the point that Tarik mentioned, like, does it give like solace, even a part of solace to themselves? So, like, I don't really have an answer to this, but there is a point mentioned in PDF page number 84 that sometimes you can change the psychic space, the landscape of the emotions by carrying out actions in the physical world. I suppose in a way that's what art is. Certainly the near magical art that फिर वो W वाला कुछ तो नाम है जो I don't know how to pronounce, would soon begin to make as he turned increasingly from destruction to creation. So I think it just changes their accelerated destruction to, I think, a gradual and slower destruction. I don't think it does them anything much better.
I'm going a little off topic, but there's a show called Doctor Who. And in one of the episodes, what they do is like in Doctor Who, the main character has a time machine. So what they do is they meet Van Gogh and they find Van Gogh to be very depressed because he does not feel validated in his time. So they bring him to the contemporary time and they take him to the Van Gogh gallery, and it just reduces Van Gogh to tears just to see his art being appreciated like this. And I just wish we could do this with all these artists, especially Daja, who did not receive appreciation in his time at all. And I'm just trying to imagine what that would be like to transport him right now and to like take him to that gallery and see what's happening with his art, with his apartment ka recreation and all that.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being a little pessimistic here, but I just feel that for a person like that, they'll not even see it as real. Matlab, like they'll just get repulsed to the idea of so many people appreciating it. Like I just feel like they'll not take it well as well. It's a possibility. Like,
It's a
arey,
possibility.
I don't know. Matlab, that could be their impulse as well to matlab, to lash out. Like, what the hell? Like, this was not supposed to be here. Like, I feel naked right now, like because of this. I feel vulnerable,
Yeah,
and I'm
Mm.
out there now.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So, especially that guy that you mentioned, because I've not read
Yeah.
anything about him right now, but the way you guys have explained him to me right now, he
Yeah,
could be the guy.
yeah.
Even
He-
Kafka, for that matter.
Yeah.
Kafka would go and find his friend and just try and kill him. Like, भाई तू क्या मतलब जो मना किया था ना मैंने. So like,
Exactly. It's so non-consensual in some ways.
it depends on the artist as well. Probably Andy Warhol would be somebody who would enjoy it more. I feel just seeing how
True,
accepting
true.
society, especially certain subcultures, have become. I think he would be happy. I personally feel.
I would like to examine this in another context as well, because in the digital loneliness section, there is one part where they they demonstrate how in the modern world, in the digital world, everyone is hungry for attention. Like for a lot of people, like if they are walking down the street and if they see themselves on television sets everywhere they go, they'll feel happy, they'll feel wanted. And in older artists, we see this tendency to be very afraid of exposure. Do you think that has changed to a large extent, or do you think that even today people are afraid of being exposed, afraid of their private things being exposed, or are people like more fame hungry even at the cost of compromising their privacy, especially like when you consider that we live in the era of vlogs, we live in the era of live streams and Instagrams and now even be reels where celebrities are posting stuff in real time, like without much curation and intermediation. And we have shows like Big Boss and Big Brother doing well. So do you think that people of today are as exposure conscious as people of yesteryears?
I think we definitely are. From whatever I read in the book and from what I surmise, I think there is an extreme amount of consciousness. It's just that we are very, very concerned with curating our feed, right? Because I think it's coming from consciousness that this level of filtering and this level of curation and this level of our lives as content is out there, right? Because ultimately I think it's like it's a lack of vulnerability in all the content, right? Because I'm going to show exactly how I want to show myself all the time. So actually, it is a fear of exposure, right? Which is very, very, very similar to if you look at Warhol's entire experience and his diary entries, it's very, very similar to the way that he expresses this the social anxiety, the fear of being seen in a certain way, and the curation of how he wants to be seen. It's not even crazy because I feel like I can it's so relatable because I can see it in the milieu that we have at the moment.
I wanted to talk a little bit about anonymity and insignificance, and just like from a more personal standpoint, and not just specifically from the book, because I would obviously love if we could get more examples from that. What does the idea of anonymity mean to you? Like, let's say for example, I'm in a local train in Mumbai. The idea of anonymity and the idea that I can keep my headphones on without actually having anything on, like मैं सुन कुछ नहीं रहा हूँ, but the idea that I can do that and nobody will bother me just because I have that on, or yeah, this it comforts me. This anonymity comforts me. But does anonymity comfort you in some way, or does it isolate you, scare you? Matlab, where are you with the idea of anonymity in your life?
Yeah, I think this is something that the writer touches upon in the book. That okay, so I'll just quote a few lines. What I'm trying to say is that Harris predicted the internet's social function, and that he did so in part by intuiting the power of loneliness as a driving force. He understood the strength of people's longing for contact and attention, and he also grasped the counterweight of the fear of intimacy, the need for screens of every kind. So, the argument that the writer makes in this book is that when we got attuned to devices and the internet, then our attitude towards social interactions also changed, because now we were habituated to having social interaction on our terms, on our time, which was facilitated by anonymity. But like real world interactions, की spontaneity became something that intimidated us to some extent. We craved that because as humans we do crave connection and conversation, but a part of it even scares us because we don't have absolute control over real world conversations that we have over our virtual conversations.
There is this innate urge to share, and I want to ask everyone here. Um, there are these one brief changes, like pivotal changes होते हैं जब life में, that those are the periods when you become increasingly lonely. Like I'm so scared of switching my job कि मैं कहीं दूसरी जगह जाई और बाई चांस दूसरे शहर में भी जाना पड़ा, मतलब मैं तो सब छोड़ के चली जाऊंगी ना. मतलब मेरे एग्जिस्टिंग जो मेरे दोस्त है, मेरी फैमिली भी यहाँ पे ही है आधी, तो दोस्त भी मेरे यहाँ पे, सब यहीं पे, और मुझे सडनली कहीं जाना पड़ेगा तो आई एम ऑलरेडी प्रिपेयरिंग माई सेल्फ फॉर इट कि हाउ विल आई बी एबल टू डील विद द सिटी चेंज, द जॉब चेंज. सिमिलरली ऐसा जब मैं भोपाल से बॉम्बे आई थी, देयर वाज दिस टाइम कि कॉलेज में तो बहुत धीरे बनता था और नेक्स्ट लेवल, मतलब आते से ही कल्चर शॉक ही था, और हम 2 महीने तो कल्चर शॉक से भी बाहर नहीं निकले थे. एंड देन आई यूज्ड टू मेक दिस कैलकुलेशंस कि ठीक है, मुझे तो बुरा लग रहा है कि मेरे भोपाल वाले फ्रेंड बहुत ज्यादा पढ़ाई में व्यस्त हो गए हैं, whatever, और देयर लाइफ इज sort of normal only because they are probably with the same friends, they're probably going to the same classes, they're probably going to the same places to eat food. I am here alone. So I used to make this calculation कि मैं संडे को एक ही मैसेज करूंगी, and then the entire week I won't talk. और अगर कुछ मैसेज आया भी तो मैं उसका बहुत sarcastic रिप्लाई दूंगी in a way like I used to hint कि I am lonely, but I don't need you to fill that void for a bit. So I want to ask anyone, have you made such, like you want to make the other person realize, but you also do not want to, and you are sort of telling yourself in a way कि you have to deal with this phenomenon on your own, क्योंकि कोई physically तो वैसे भी नहीं है इसको करने के लिए, और किसी की बातें कितना ही help करने वाली.
Bhumika, I'm really reminded of there's a particular work by Alain de Botton, and he's written about sulking in relationships and love. And he talks about
Okay.
how often when we are in a friendship or a relationship, there is a lot of times that we sulk because we feel very inwardly angry and resentful that someone has not given us that attention or not looked at us or not talked to us, and we feel very angry, and so we don't even want to tell them because we feel like if I could tell them, then they don't love me anyway, right? Like, so why should I even tell them? So like,
Yeah.
they have to figure it out, like figure me out
Figure
is
me out,
the
yes.
basic theme of that relationship for a long time after that. And I think that's really lonely, because the more you keep this idea of figure me out, the more people are just like, I don't know what they mean, so I guess I'm just going to stay away. And then you get even more resentful, and
This craving for a conversation and connection again. So one interesting type of this craving is a craving even for small talk. काफी लोगों को small talk चाहिए to get rid of the loneliness. And for a lot of people, this doesn't work. Like for a lot of people, small talk just aggravates their loneliness because they feel that they're not getting anything out of this conversation. And this is something that even Warhol explored. Let me read this line. He was fascinated by empty or deformed language, by chatter and trash, by glitches and botches in conversation. The films he made in the early 1960s are full of people failing to understand or listen to each other, an investigative process that sharpened with the arrival of the tape machine. But like despite this, you find a lot of people in your regular life who are satiated, like whose loneliness is kept at bay just out of like small talk about routine things that happen. I mean, we all have relatives in our family, Joe. I say they would spend hours on call just exchanging small daily updates. So, what do you think? Is small talk something that heals us, or is small talk something that, like, is it a disease that aggravates our loneliness?
I think someone who doesn't know what meaningful conversations are, for them, small talk is the only way. Of course, void fill करने के लिए कुछ तो चाहिए ना, and then only some people are able to articulate what exactly they need to fill the void.
Aren't they better off in a way? Because when you know that what
Yeah.
meaningful conversations are, and you
Yeah.
know how rare they are, you just
Yeah.
feel more sad.
I think that is the difference between artists and consumers. Artists have meaningful conversations in a way, and those who do not, they are consumers.
I think a lot also depends on the subtext in the conversations. A lot of times, if you notice, particularly traditionally in Indian families, I don't think a lot of times people are used to talking about like
Purpose of life.
yeah,
For
purpose of
example.
life, emotional aspects of being and all of that, right? Like a lot of times people, I mean if I look at my parents, the most important thing they would ask me is, did you eat today, and are you feeling well, and all of these things. And I think there's a lot of subtext and reading between the lines that I think transpires between the sender and receiver, which makes these conversations, which makes the meaning of the conversations different, whether it is a small talk or whether it's a very uh, emotionally depth or very heavy conversation intellectually or all of that, right? Like I think when the receiver and the sender have very different wavelengths, whether it's small talk or whether it's talk that is not so small talk, I think the end result can be very different according to that. I'm remembering in English. I don't know if everybody's seen the film, but in
Yeah.
English there is Sridevi's character who is just learning to speak English, and then there is this French man who's a friend, and they have this scene where they are talking to each other, and he is speaking in French and she is speaking in Hindi, and they make such a connection. So actually it is not even, they don't understand what the other person is saying actually. So it's not even, you can't even tell whether it's small talk or what talk it is, but they still make a connection, and there's still some change that happens from there.
So about this small talk question also, when I said that I don't have proper words, but the book has all the pointers. So it's once again there. So there's a point mentioned that all those personality devices he had, all those denials and kind of keggy self-inventions were about: don't understand me, don't look into me, don't analyze, don't get too near me because I'm not sure what's there. I don't want to think about it. I'm not sure I like myself. So sometimes small talks are also because people are terrified of what might come up about them, and they might not be in a state to take it in. Like there was this also one point mentioned that it gives a release from the burden of needing to look unconcerned or worse, appealing. Like when times like that come, you are not sure if you can take it yourself, and if in that times you have to also look presentable and appealing and in a socially acceptable way, I think it becomes a lot for people who stay mostly to themselves. So small talks can like be an out, like a way for them to even speak out but not reveal much about them, that it becomes like it comes to them.
So this wavelength that we are talking about, I think it's a proxy for intimacy that this author writes about. So the author writes, if loneliness is to be defined as a desire for intimacy, then included within that is the need to express oneself and to be heard, to share thoughts, experiences, and feelings. Now, the thing is that now that we have established that it's not always the verbal communication that defines whether our loneliness is cured, and it works both ways. Like even when you have deep conversations with people with whom your frequencies don't match, you still feel hollow inside, right? As you rightly mentioned, Sankalp. So what is it that builds intimacy? Or when we talk about having a conversation, what does having a conversation mean? Because like in general context, having a conversation means speaking with each other or using body language and those cues. But we know कि ऐसे कुछ लोग के साथ वो topics भी बहुत mundane होते हैं and body language भी बहुत special नहीं होती, but still we are able to forge a connection. So what about us is that part that actually builds a connection with other people, if it is not language or if it is not as a non-verbal cues?
How do you then like lay the ground rules for intimacy in such a situation like that? Like it's very confusing. I think it evolves as well. But at its core, it's about being like intimacy. I think it's not a it's an emotion, like it's a momentary feeling for according to me. It's not something that stays at times. Like I'm seeing it as more like a momentary emotion right now, because when I'm at the same again wavelength, in the same moment, sharing the same present moment in the same time and space with that specific person, sharing respect, sharing the same context, like वो जो सब जब same उस पे होता है ना, when that is there, that is that moment when you feel intimate. It is not like, I don't think it is a long term thing. Like it happens sporadically. That feeling of intimacy with somebody probably happens a little more sporadically than we actually imagine, because the same person can make you feel repulsed when they ask the same question again, ki, how are you feeling? Like,
is loneliness an urban phenomenon? और मुझे लगता है we used to be part of such big joint families. Even your neighbor was part of another big joint family. और 7-7 8-8 भाई बहन होते थे. तो मतलब मैंने नहीं देखा कभी भी वो feeling of loneliness till I got married, then relocated, and first 14-15 years we were in a joint family. Then the children moved away. Up there are, of course, we are surrounded by friends, family, but just the two of us living. So there are moments, बहुत कम होते, but times of loneliness होता है, then you shake off the feeling.
To an extent, I agree with Sangeeta Aunty, because the thing is that loneliness is something that is universal in its appearance, but how it's interpreted is very different. Because in rural areas, they take it as solitude. Jabki urban areas mein, there's this conflict that you experience because you see people all around you, yet you are feeling lonely, and that hits hard. Rural areas mein that doesn't happen because you can see that your environment around you is empty and you feel lonely, so things are in harmony. But yahan pe that conflict is something which stays away. Like this idea of being alone in a crowd, not just being alone, but being alone in a crowd, that is what eats away at you. So like a person who is alone in a city probably feels that loneliness more than maybe Robinson Crusoe did on a solitary island.
let's just talk about or share any favorite paragraph or favorite lines from the book and wrap up the conversation.
Just two parallels that I found very interesting outside this book. So first of all, Andy Warhol. So when I read about him in this book now, I instantly thought of Casey Neistat. If you have seen his work on YouTube, so he's a very similar person. He also lives in New York. He also he compulsively records every day of his life. He became famous through daily vlogs in which he showed the mundane things that happen in New York. But there is one, and like he's also resistant against the mainstream form of expression, and he's also very performative and deliberate about his work, and he's also very lonely like Warhol. But there's one notable difference. uh, Andy Warhol used the rear camera while Casey Neistat uses the front camera. So I think that is a parallel I found quite interesting. And one more parallel, this is with one of my beloved writers, Haruki Murakami. And there's a part from Kafka on the Shore which describes loneliness really well. I think it's from the preface only. I would like to read this small bit. Sometimes fate is like a small sandstorm that keeps changing direction. You change direction, but the sandstorm chases you. You turn again, but the storm adjusts. Over and over, you play this out like some ominous dance with death just before dawn. Why? Because the storm isn't something that blew in from far away, something that has nothing to do with you. The storm is you, something inside you. So all you can do is give in to it, step right inside the storm, closing your eyes and plugging up your ears so the sand doesn't get in, and walk through it step by step. There's no sun there, no moon, no direction, no sense of time, just fine white sand swirling up into the sky like pulverized bones. That's the kind of sandstorm you need to imagine. And you really will have to make it through that violent metaphysical symbolic storm. No matter how metaphysical or symbolic it might be, make no mistake about it, it will cut through flesh like 1,000 razor blades. People will bleed there and you will bleed too. Hot red blood. You'll catch that blood in your hands, your own blood and the blood of others. And once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure, in fact, whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain, when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. That's what the storm is about.
I'm on that phase of life where the art has lesser meaning for me than the artist's ability, willingness एंड एग्जीक्यूशन पार्ट ऑफ इट कि अगर कोई आर्टिस्ट ने सोच लिया ना कि मुझे ऐसा बनाना है तो मेरे लिए वही वो आर्टिस्ट जीत गया, क्योंकि मुझे पता है कि एक बार आर्ट बन भी गया, पैसा तो बहुत ही खर्च हो जाता है, एनवायरमेंटली तो पता नहीं कितना ही वेस्ट होता है फिर, और फिर उसके बाद उसका रिप्रेजेंटेशन किसी ने उल्टा समझ लिया तो उसके लिए स्कोर है. तो फॉर मी आर्टिस्ट इंटेंशन एंड थॉट इज इनफ. एंड हियर जो डेविड वॉनरोविच है उसका काफी अच्छे से, मतलब ऑल ऑफ हिज आर्ट वाज समवॉट pointing out the wrongs with the society, how government is not proactive. And here I'll just read what Olivia has written about it. Ponerovis articulated a sense of being not just outside society, but actively antagonistic to its strictures, its tolerance of different life forms. The pre-invented world, he'd started calling it, the pre-invented existence of mainstream experience, which seems benign, even banal, its walls almost invisible until you're crushed against them. This is my favorite part. All his work was an act of resistance against this dominating force driven by a desire to contact and inhabit a deeper, wilder mode of being. And I feel, matlab, the fact that Olivia was able to understand and paraphrase David's work as this part made me feel that she's accomplished her motive of writing this book.